Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 350, The Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921. Last time, we talked about the people who influenced the decision-making of the Russian Tsars. Today, we recount the events that led up to the ill-fated Kronstadt Rebellion against the Bolsheviks in 1921. My main source for this episode is from my former Russian history professor at Queen's College, Dr. Paul Avrich, who wrote the book on the subject entitled, aptly, Kronstadt 1921. Before we get into the main topic, I want to situate everyone with where Kronstadt is and why it was such an important place relating to the revolutions between 1905 and 1921. It is a Russian port city known as Kotlin Island, about 30 kilometers or 19 miles west of St. Petersburg, near the head of the Gulf of Finland. Founded in 1704 by Peter the Great, it was the main base of the Russian Baltic Fleet and guards the naval approaches to St. Petersburg. I also wanted to clarify this rebellion versus the three other mutinies that occurred at Kronstadt. There were three other events that occurred here that would make the place a hotbed of revolt. They occurred in 1905, 1906, and 1917. The first one, October 26, 1905, was due to the poor working conditions the sailors stationed there had to endure. They presented their grievances to Colonel Osipov. They were dismissed, which caused widespread rioting. On June 19, 1906, another mutiny occurred due to Tsar Nicholas II's dissolution of the First Duma earlier that month. When the uprising was put down the next day, hundreds of sailors were imprisoned, with 36 ringleaders executed. Now, the third mutiny was the biggest to date. It involved over 20,000 men, or the entire garrison stationed at Kronstadt. The rebellion was in response to the growing discontent over the Russian positions in World War I and the protests that were rampant in St. Petersburg. It would begin in the evening of February 28, 1917, after the garrison gathered around the residence of Admiral Wirin, the commandant of the naval base. He had come out of a meeting with senior officers to see if they could use the men under them to squash the revolts going on in St. Petersburg. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that the opposite would happen as the men were on the side of the Soviets. Wirin would be shot to death on March 1st. 40 officers and 200 sailors would be killed in the three-day mutiny. And this was one of the reasons why Tsar Nicholas II would abdicate the throne. Now, it cannot be said that without the support of the Kronstadt garrison, you could have prevented the abdication, or if they had decided to help the police in St. Petersburg to squash the riots, would have made a difference. Hindsight, of course, is 20/20. The feeling at the time gave the protesters a shot in the arm and made the Bolsheviks and the Soviets bolder and surer of the direction they were on. This is what makes the rebellion of 1921 all that more remarkable. In 1917, the rallying cry of the Bolsheviks was, "Power to the Soviets." Over the next few years, when dealing with the Russian Civil War, the cry changed to, "Power to the Bolsheviks." This wouldn't have been much of a problem for the men at Kronstadt if the conditions there hadn't been absolutely atrocious. This wasn't much different from what much of the Russian people were dealing with between 1918 and 1921. But the garrison at Kronstadt felt that they were instrumental in the Bolsheviks gaining power and that they deserved much better than the general public. The general public, though, in particular the Petrograd workers, who were key elements of February and October 1917 revolutions, were also becoming disgusted with the Bolsheviks. They were tired of the food shortages and the treatment of themselves by the Bolsheviks. That wasn't going to change, as Lenin was once quoted as saying, "I can't listen to music because it makes you want to say silly things and pat people on the head. But you have to beat people's heads, beat them mercilessly. What a devilish difficult job I have." I love the description that my former professor, Dr. Avrich, wrote in his book about the Soviet state in 1921. Quote, "Soviet Russia in 1921 was not the Leviathan of recent decades." And remember, he was writing this in 1970. It was a young and insecure state, faced with a rebellious population at home and implacable enemies abroad who longed to see the Bolsheviks ousted from power. We see the Soviet Union from our experience, if we are old enough, or through the historical lens that this podcast and many books give us. Rarely do we hear about the tenuous position the country was in 1921. Due to the ongoing civil war, Lenin decided to implement something known as war communism. It would force the privatization of large and small businesses and would control all grain distribution so that the Red Army was guaranteed to be fed. This led to deep resentment from farmers and peasants who thought that this was no different than the Tsarist regime that they had just overthrown. War communism, combined with extremely poor harvests, were causing food shortages, which the people blamed on their leaders. The garrison at Kronstadt was suffering as much as, or even more than, the average Russian. The Tambov uprising was in full swing between 1920 and 22. In February 1921, there were an estimated 155 peasant revolts in Russia. In Petrograd, the very same workers who helped take down the Romanovs were out in the streets protesting against conditions. On March 1st, 1921, an assembly of the men in Kronstadt was held with between about 15 to 16,000 attending. The Bolsheviks sent Mikhail Kalinin, who was the mayor of Petrograd after the Bolshevik takeover in 1917. He was also chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. But nothing, he would say, would alleviate the furor of the soldiers and sailors. In Kronstadt, the mutiny was focused on two battleships, the Petropavlovsk and the Sevastopol. Both had important revolutionary pedigrees. Here is one of the pleas from a workers' strike. Quote, "We, the representatives of the factories and socialist parties in Petrograd, despite much that we disagree upon, have united to pursue the following goals: overthrow of the Bolshevik dictatorship, free elections to the Soviets, freedom of speech, press, and assembly for all, and the release of political prisoners." In response, Lenin decided to declare martial law. He knew that his government was teetering on collapse, and that would not happen under his watch. Troops fired upon protesters, which drove them underground. But a far greater threat was brewing in Kronstadt. Here is how Martin Sixsmith describes things in his book, Russia. Quote, "Here in Kronstadt's underground tunnels and on the cruisers and battleships laying at anchor, meetings were being held. The mood among the fortress's 30,000 sailors was ugly, and their anger was directed at the Bolsheviks. The democracy of the Soviets had been crushed by a one-party communist dictatorship." Now, according to Avrich, quote, "The rebels demanded reform rather than the demise of the Bolshevik Party to eliminate its strong authoritarian and bureaucratic tendency that had grown during the Civil War, an opinion held by oppositional currents within the party itself. The rebels maintained that the party had sacrificed its democratic, egalitarian ideals to remain in power. This was done to show that they weren't against the revolution of 1917 and that they were not puppets of the whites or other counter-revolutionaries. The leaders of Kronstadt sailors decided that they needed to produce a manifesto expressing their anger and their demands. They felt that they had enough military power to rebuff any attack by the Red Army, much of which was still fighting against the White Army, although they were winning the Russian Civil War by this time. A delegation led by Stepan Petrochenko, who was the chief clerk of the Petropavlovsk, would draft a paper to send to Lenin. They had the following 15 demands. 1. In view of the fact that the present Soviets do not express the will of the workers and peasants, immediately to hold new elections by secret ballot, the pre-election campaign to have full freedom of agitation among the workers and peasants. 2. To establish freedom of speech and press for workers and peasants, for anarchists and left socialist parties. 3. To secure freedom of assembly for labor unions and peasant organizations. 4. To call a non-partisan conference of the workers, Red Army soldiers and sailors of Petrograd, Kronstadt, and of Petrograd province no later than March 10, 1921. 5. To liberate all political prisoners of socialist parties, as well as all workers, soldiers, and sailors imprisoned in connection with labor and peasant movements. 6. To elect a commission to review the cases of those held in prisons and concentration camps. 7. To abolish all political bureaus because no party should be given special privileges in the propagation of its ideas or receive the financial support of the government for such purposes. Instead, there should be established educational and cultural commissions, locally elected and financed by the government. 8. To abolish immediately all Bolshevik units armed to suppress traffic and confiscate foodstuffs. 9. To equalize the rations of all who work, with the exception of those employed in trades detrimental to health. 10. To abolish the Bolshevik fighting detachments in all branches of the army, as well as the Bolshevik guards kept on duty in mills and factories. Should such guards or military detachments be found necessary, they are to be appointed in the army from the ranks and in the factories according to the judgment of the workers. 11. To give the peasants full freedom of action in regard to their land and also right to keep cattle on condition that the peasants manage, within their own means, that is, without employing hired labor. To request all branches of the army, as well as our comrades, the military corsanti, to concur in our resolutions. 13. To demand that the press give the fullest publicity to our resolutions. 14. To appoint a traveling commission of control. And finally, number 15, to allow free individual small-scale production by one's own efforts. Now, Kalinin thought that demands were reasonable, with a few changes needed. The people of Petrograd and even the Petrograd Soviet thought that things could be worked out, warning the men in Kronstadt that they had been misled by certain counter-revolutionary agents. Moscow, on the other hand, did not feel they needed to be lenient with the rebels at all. When these demands were delivered to Lenin, he was at the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party on March 8th. Lenin was under no delusion that this represented the greatest threat to the Bolshevik control of Russia. He sent Trotsky to lead an assault on the heavily fortified Kronstadt naval base. Because of the notoriety of the men at Kronstadt, the Bolsheviks had to come up with a way to explain why they had turned on them. On March 5th, 1921, the insurgents were branded as puppets of the White Army. On March 7th, 1921, with 60,000 men, led by the up-and-coming commander Mikhail Tukhachevsky, as well as the head of the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Red Army began their assault on Kronstadt by traversing the ice which had yet begun to melt. The march was approximately 5 miles. The revolting sailors, though, were well prepared to repulse the first attack. Thousands of men in the Red Army were slaughtered as they tried to capture the station. Wave after wave of men were cut down, causing Trotsky and Zinoviev, who was the chair of the Petrograd Council, to call for a retreat. According to Average, Kronstadt had reinforced its defenses with 2,000 civilian recruits atop the 13,000-man garrison. The city itself had a thick wall, and across the island's forts and ships were 138 cannons and 68 machine guns. The 14 forts had turrets and thick armor. Artillery on Kronstadt's main warships, Petropavlovsk and Sevastopol, outclassed that of the most powerful mainland fort, but was frozen in disadvantaged positions. While this seemingly was a winnable situation for the Kronstadt sailors, there were a number of problems that they had to deal with. They lacked adequate ammunition, winter clothing, food reserves, and fuel to fend off a prolonged siege. Trotsky and Zinoviev knew this, and they decided to regroup and take a week to come up with another plan of attack. On March 10th, another attack was launched with a similar outcome. Nothing was accomplished aside from the deaths of a few hundred Red Army soldiers. Other incursions were conducted on the 11th and 12th. What unnerved the Red Army commanders was the knowledge that the ice bridge to the island would soon melt away, making their job far more difficult, if not impossible. It was here that the fledgling Red Army Air Force would come into action. They flew numerous bombing raids, hoping to soften up the fortifications. This also proved to be somewhat useless, as air power was still in its infancy. But things weren't all that bright and cheery with the men in the Kronstadt garrison. The air raids just added another layer of despair on the soldiers, not allowing them to have moments rest from the numerous attacks. What the rebels in Kronstadt did not know was that things in Russia were changing. Lenin saw the writing on the wall and decided that it was in the Bolsheviks' best interest to stop war communism if they wanted to stay in power. At the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party, the idea of a new economic policy, or NEP, had passed and would be implemented immediately. While the 10th Congress strengthened the grip the Bolsheviks had on the country and reinforced the one-party system, it also gave economic relief to the common person. Grain seizures ended, small profits could be made, and private cooperatives could run small businesses. While this was done to appease the general population, it actually caused a major rift within the Bolshevik Party. What is interesting is that the Kronstadt Rebellion had little to no effect on the adoption of the new economic policy. Lenin had already decided to implement the plan before there was even a hint of any activity in Kronstadt. What the rebellion did do was hasten the implementation of the NEP. The events at Kronstadt also convinced Vladimir Lenin that he had to crush any and all opposition to Bolshevik rule. The final attack on the stronghold of Kronstadt began in the afternoon of March 16, 1921. Tukhachevsky led over 50,000 men into battle against the 15,000 rebels. There was one major difference. The men who would eventually take Kronstadt were far better trained and much more motivated than the group that had tried the first time. They also had 300 members of the 10th Congress joining them to boost morale. Tukhachevsky decided on invading from 3 different directions: south, east, and north. Before committing foot soldiers into the fray, intense and long-lasting artillery fire rained down on the rebels, especially on the 2 ships, the Sevastopol and Petropavlovsk. Both suffered extreme damage and casualties. Instead of immediately attacking, the Red Army held back for a while, causing the men in Kronstadt to be forced to stay awake through the night. Quietly, in the early morning of the 17th, 2 columns from the north began to quietly advance. They were spotted near their target where intense fighting began. Back and forth the battles went until 2 forts were captured by the Red Army. By 1 a.m., the final northern fort was captured. From the south, after dawn broke, the fighting intensified, with both sides suffering terrific losses of life, but with the Red Army gaining ground until they met fierce resistance. Again from Average, quote, rebel reinforcements forced the Bolsheviks to retreat. More than half of the 79th Infantry Brigade had died, including delegates from the 10th Party Council. While the southern attacks began to stall, those on the eastern front made steady headway. They made their way through the Petrograd Grate, which allowed them to enter the city itself. Inside, they found a veritable hell, with bullets seemingly coming from every window and roof. Fighting proceeded through the streets, with casualties mounting on both sides. Throughout the day, the Red Army continued to gain ground and take buildings and forts. Seeing this, a large number of the Kronstadt sailors knew that all was lost, with many, estimated at about 8,000, headed towards Finland, knowing if they were captured, they would either be executed or sent to a prison camp. By the morning of the 18th, the naval base of Kronstadt was in the hands of the Bolsheviks. 2,000 sailors had been captured, with 1,000 having given up their lives. On the Bolshevik side, though, it was estimated that there were 10,000 dead, wounded, or missing, including 15 Congress delegates. The aftermath saw hundreds of men killed in retaliation. I mean, they would just kill them in the streets. They were so angry that so many of their Red Army buddies had been murdered. The remaining men were sent to mainland prisons, where most would die of starvation or execution. As Paul Average wrote in his book, Kronstadt 1921, quote, as in all failed revolts in authoritarian regimes, the rebels realized the opposite of their aims: harsher dictatorship and less popular self-government. Well, I can't believe we've made it to episode 350. At the end of this month, April, will represent the start of the 16th year of the Russian Rulers History Podcast, or Russian History Retold. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we cover the Battle of Berlin, a battle that would help bring the end of World War II, one of the last major offensives of the European theater of World War II, and one that my mother almost got caught in. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.